It was their Constitution Day talk.
And thank you for organizing. A special thanks to Professor Silva, Professor Dorsey. They did some extra special arrangements to make sure we are all coordinated for today. For those of you, which I think most of you do know me, I'm Cindy Milo with Cengage Learning, and I'm your local representative for the publishing company that you use for your government textbook. I actually met her at one of your classes.
You look different.
So we wanted to not only represent our publishing company as far as materials and resources go, but as support for your academic experience. So by offering authors to come in, we have the author of The Enduring Democracy, your government 2305 federal government textbook, here all the way from Connecticut today. So he is going to talk to you since it is Constitution Day. Anybody know what Constitution Day is? It was written.
Approved.
The day it was approved, right? Right,
Approved in
professors?
Philadelphia,
Approved, okay.
1787.
So
Big
it's something
Congress
I
said
learned
we
too.
would talk about it.
Well, I guess that's a spoiler, isn't it?
You're giving it away.
The big surprise.
They may not have known it was.
For those of you, I know some of you actually met Dr. Yoloff. He is a professor at UConn, University of Connecticut, and he still teaches political science. His specialties are in constitutional law, judicial politics, and executive branch politics. And I'm sure he'll elaborate more on that. He's also written extensively some journals as well as textbooks and published books in addition. So we're really happy to have him here. He likes to get involved and meet the students and instructors using his book. So without further ado, I want to present to you Dr. Yellow.
Well, thank you, Cindy. Thank you all. Thank you for coming out on this 226th anniversary. That's what it is, 226th anniversary. And I'm glad that Cindy mentioned September 17th, because the nice thing about the Constitution, as some of you may know, is we actually have a day, right? That's the day it was completed. It wasn't the day it was ratified. Obviously, the states had to do that, state ratifying conventions. And it wasn't the day it was actually put into practice. That would be March 1789. But we do know it's the day it was completed in Philadelphia, and there's a lot less mystery about that than there is about the Declaration of Independence, right? Which we think is July 4th, but as many of you may know, the actual day that the signing was completed of the Declaration of Independence, anybody know that? July 2nd. Now, so maybe we could say July 2nd is our Independence Day, but now hold on. You declare independence. Don't you have, is it really a Declaration of Independence? Does it really matter if the people who are fighting for your independence, your army, don't know about it? We know that George Washington did not actually learn there even was a Declaration of Independence until July 8th. So maybe that should be the Declaration of Independence. But wait, there's more, right? Is it really a Declaration of Independence? Does it really matter if the group or the country you are declaring independence from, Britain, does not know it? All the evidence indicates that the Parliament and the King of England did not even learn of a Declaration of Independence until August 30th. So truly that should be Independence Day, but that's not going to happen, is it? Because it's too close to Labor Day. We get those 2 holiday weekends. We want both. So let's face it. Let's face it. We're going to stick with July 4th, but this could be our secret and the secret of the people who might be watching this later, that at least with the Constitution we have a day. And what I wanted to talk about today is something that kind of bothers us a lot, this notion of a Washington, D.C. stuck in partisan gridlock, but it bothers us in a way that we don't often think has anything to do with the Constitution. And the truth is, in our political life, in some ways everything has to do with the Constitution. So I want to kind of talk about some familiar subjects, but kind of think of them in a different way. One thing that you've probably thought about a lot is that it does seem like things aren't happening in Washington, but surely that happens all the time. Not this bad. I mean, I think you have to kind of put things a little bit in historical perspective, as I do in my book and as I like to do when I talk to my students back at Connecticut. And so let's talk for a second about the 112th Congress. That was the Congress of 2011 and 2012 that completed its work at the end of last year. If you think the 112th Congress was bad, one thing you might want to do is look at the numbers, and you'll realize that, yeah, it kind of was. This is a chart of public laws passed per session of Congress, starting with the 80th Congress and going all the way to the 112th. And as you can see, don't know if my, oops, don't want to go too fast on there, but as you can see with my little laser pointer, which doesn't work that well, the 112th Congress was it was an illustration of futility. And to put this in even a little more historical perspective, some of you might know that Harry Truman, when he was running for his first election in 1948, that was his first because he became president as a result of Roosevelt's death, when he actually ran for president for the first time in 1948, he ran against the do-nothing 80th Congress, the 80th Congress that did nothing. This is the 80th Congress, which passed over 900 bills. Compared to the 112th Congress, the 80th Congress is an energetic, active bunch that will not stop legislating. And I put that into a little perspective because when we say things are bad, we really actually mean it. we on any historical measure, but certainly in terms of laws passed, the 112th Congress is not something to be proud of or proud of being part of. In other words, it was that bad. And some highlights that you might remember, we had the near shutdown of the government. Well, that's nothing new. But what's interesting to me is normally when we have a shutdown of government, it's considered bad, and then afterwards we fix something that caused the near shutdown or the shutdown. We change the process so it doesn't keep happening again. In this case, if you look carefully, you'll find we averted the shutdown, but at the end of it, we did nothing to avert future shutdowns. It's just as likely that one could come this year as it was when it happened last year, almost happened last year, and that's very interesting, informative, and dismaying all at once. No legislative accomplishments are one thing, but this is in areas that we were told by both Republicans and Democrats something should be passed. Maybe something weak, right? But something. Whether it's on immigration, which both parties set forth that they wanted to do something on, guns, tax reform, that was something everybody seemed to agree we needed to do something. Infrastructure, a couple people were commenting about some of the roads driving in and how bumpy they were. Again, not to say we should have had landmark legislation in any of these things. Perhaps some of this legislation should have been passed to fix things that are already in place. None of it was passed, and it's going to be quite an interesting thing to watch if we can get something passed in the future. And yet, here it goes. The 112th Congress was clearly bad. By all measures, what we're dealing with now is even worse than what happened during the 112th Congress. Now, we have some very interesting numbers for the first 8 months. Remember, we're still in 2013. So you get set, hold on to your seatbelts. Maybe will be more fun coming, okay? Most people tell us that the first 8 months of 2013 were the least productive months in the history of American lawmaking. 2,899 bills were actually introduced. Nearly 2,900 bills were actually introduced in Congress. How many passed? 15. 15. And that includes 6 bills that commemorate coins, okay? And I did some research because only the best, okay? Only the best for you guys. And I did some research. At least one of the commemorative coin bills that was signed commemorates World War I, okay? And our involvement in World War I and the 100th anniversary of that. Now, that's interesting, I think, because World War I did not begin in 1913. Anybody know what year it was? 1914. So if you want to commemorate it, we have a whole year to go. And U.S. did not get involved in 1914. It got involved in 1917. So I'm so glad we're working hard because we have 4 whole years to really commemorate with coins. And that, no immigration, no tax reform legislation, but we're on the mark. Now let me say this. It's possible to reasonably take the position, no laws is good. I don't like laws. There's too many laws right now in Washington. We need to stop passing laws. We have too much government. That is an extremely reasonable position to take. But if you're going to take that position, that reasonable position, surely you're in favor then of repealing laws, right? Getting rid of bad ones on the books. Very few people think we're in a perfect state of nirvana right now. Don't touch anything. You might think we should pass good laws. You might think we should get rid of laws. Well, you know what? If you're interested in actually reducing government, you need to be equally frustrated. No repeals of any laws have been passed in 2013. You're not passing laws, you're not getting rid of bad laws, nothing is going on. And that is, I think, interesting. And as a result, the public is speaking out and they're not that happy. Right? When you start looking at the popularity of Congress, you can eat your heart out, Paris Hilton, because while Paris Hilton only enjoys a 15% approval rating, according to Gallup some years ago, Congress's approval rating in October 2011, and I checked yesterday, it's the same today, is below 10%. It is 9%. Okay? Now let's be clear on the perspective here. The British Petroleum, remember them? They spilled oil into the Gulf of Mexico. During that spill, 16% approved of British Petroleum. Only 9% approve of Congress. Okay, now Fidel Castro is lower. That's the one thing Congress has. They're more popular than Fidel Castro. But once he dies, you know what's going to happen. The eulogies, people only remember the good things, okay? I am almost perfectly confident that once Fidel Castro dies, Congress will be less. In fact, let's even come right out and say the irony here on Constitution Day. I would argue, and I bet you nobody here would disagree, that right now, Congress is less popular than the British Parliament and the King were on July 2nd, 1776, when we revolted against them and were willing to give up our lives for them. And I say that because I'm sure they could have at least topped 10 or 11%. I mean, Benjamin Franklin's son loved them. So I say that because this is really amazing stuff, the degree to which there is frustration in Washington, and particularly over Congress. But you know what? There's a lot of blame to go around. I don't think the news here is much better for the President of the United States. Normally in the year after you've won a re-election, and I'm talking about an actual re-election where there's agreement on both sides that you won. We know that's sometimes a difficulty in this country. In this instance, you would expect Barack Obama to enjoy something of a honeymoon. And as you probably know, nothing of the sort. His approval rating right now is down to 44%, which is, for a president less than a year after re-election, very, very low. Very low. I mean, by any modern standard. Reagan, Clinton, George W. Bush was much more popular than 44% at this point in 2005. And give him time, right? He has 3 years to go all the way down to where Congress is. It looks good compared to Congress, but it's not good for a president of the United States. The battle over debt ceilings, which we've heard something about, Congress has to reauthorize and increase the size of the ceiling on which we can borrow money and raise our debt, or we can't borrow money and do so. Every time we go up to a debt ceiling, there is a game of chicken. So far, Congress has been willing at the last minute to raise the debt ceiling. They may not be willing to do so when it comes up again in the next few months. Every time that happens, even when they raise the debt ceiling, it harms the financial standing of the United States around the world. And whether you're a Democrat or Republican, be real. This sits on the President of the United States as his legacy, as does a failure to produce immigration policy. The gun policy that the President declared when there was a shooting in my home state of Connecticut in December at Sandy Hook, and the President said we will pass something. So far, obviously nothing. Particular problems for the President in terms of getting appointments through. Just this past week, Lawrence Summers, theoretically the President's choice to head the Federal Reserve, and he withdrew his name because of a lack of support among Democrats as well as Republicans. Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who seems to support President Obama on anything, was not there for him on Lawrence Summers. Susan Rice, who was the President's choice to be Secretary of State, withdrew her name as well. So even weak presidents have been able to get appointments through. Their people, I'm not talking about the Supreme Court, I'm talking about appointments in the executive branch of government, and that has not been easy for the President as well. And what about Syria? At the time we're taping this and talking about this, the President is extremely hopeful that there's a compromise to be reached on Syria, and that Syria will agree to voluntarily eliminate its chemical weapons. I mean, all of that is in place, and there's a lot of things that have to happen for that to work. So we're hardly outside of the woods yet. But if it works perfectly, and if their Syria compromise holds, let's understand the basic political reality. The President got his political bacon saved. And by who? Vladimir Putin of the Russian Republic. Now, that cannot be a positive moment when the head of another foreign country, another powerful country, has to basically save you politically. It cannot be something that would make anybody supporting President Obama happy, and it certainly is probably causing a lot of joy in Moscow. And this is a very long way of saying that as much as a lot of people would like to think that this is about a do-nothing Congress, it's about a do-nothing political system. And it's going to have heroes and villains on both Democrat and Republican sides. Now, I like to talk, especially to students, about the question of what's at stake. Because here's the truth. As we sit here, you wonder, what does this really have to do with me? I mean, if the president ends up getting egg in his face about Syria, how does that affect me? If we're not passing laws that I don't even agree with or know about, how can that affect me? But I think there are important things at stake that we just have to recognize. And there are some very important things at stake below the radar that we don't think about a lot. But our failure to pass any kind of laws other than World War commemorative coins has an impact on us, and there is a real impact. And let me give you an example of something that's below the radar that we don't think about a lot. The U.S. Postal Service. Most of us drive up, throw our mail in. We assume it's going to get there. Most of the time it does. We get mad when it doesn't. Not such a big deal. Well, you need to consider the fact that right now, by all agreement, including the GAO, the U.S. Postal Service is losing $25 million a day. A day, right? Now, yes, that doesn't seem like a lot when you're considering a federal budget of $1 trillion. But what should be frustrating about that is we can actually do something about that. The U.S. Postal Service actually has quite a few proposals in place that they need to simply get implemented that would allow them to at least lose a lot less money. Technology about delivery systems in particular. And yet the laws don't seem to be passed by Congress to allow them to improve and enhance the technology around their delivery systems, because fundamental changes have to be passed by Congress. One of my favorite examples is beer and wine. I'm not sure you're aware, but Congress has really for many years prohibited the U.S. Postal Service from delivering beer or wine, from any kind of transaction. Have you ever noticed that? You go there and you want to send a six-pack, it's not going to be accepted. I mean, you might be able to sneak it through, but it's against federal law. There's a recognition on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, that this has grown silly. That what you've done is you've taken away a tremendous source of revenue. You're allowing private companies to basically pick up the slack and charge more money than they could if the U.S. Postal Service was a competitor. And this is just one of those things that doesn't really help anybody. And yet, while both sides seem to agree, no law is going to get passed on that. Because it's a do-nothing political system at this point that can't get together enough even when they all agree. And I'm going to say something about another subject, student debt, because this is very easy to understand. There was in place a federal law that said you cannot, for the guaranteed student loans, banks cannot charge students more than 3.4% interest. This seems like a pretty reasonable amount given that the economy is still struggling in most people's minds. 3.4%. That law was set to expire in May. It did expire. Congress, despite the fact that both John Boehner, the Republicans, and President Obama were overwhelmingly in favor of keeping that 3.4% interest rate, Congress did not, and so it is now 6.8%. It doubled. And that hurts every student who wants to borrow loans. And it's not, by the way, if you're conservative economically, it's not somehow benefiting the government. It's not somehow reducing a problem for the government. Frankly, the only people who suffer a little bit with a 3.4% are private banks. Right? The government guarantees the loans. They're not actually issuing them. So I throw that all out there because when both sides agree and yet you still can't get together, I think that's a problem, or at least it's some kind of problem that we are struggling with. Now I want to talk about why. Why are we in a situation where we're unable to even agree on basic issues other than commemorative coins? And again, we're talking about issues where Republicans and Democrats agree. And the fact that they can't get together is problematic. What's the problem? Well, obviously the polarization of Congress is a very big problem. The fact that Democrats are more liberal than they've ever been before, Republicans as a group are more conservative than they've ever been before, and we've lost what we might call a middle where you can engage in some kind of negotiation and some kind of compromise. This is a chart that shows you ideologically where Republicans in Congress and Democrats in Congress stand. This middle line here, That's the middle line of ideology. So if you're voting in a conservative direction, you'd be above the line. If you're voting in a liberal direction, you would be below the line. As you can see, focus for a second on the early 1980s, late 1970s. You see that the gap between Republicans and Southern Democrats, which would include Texas Democrats obviously, was a relatively small gap. And you know what? The political system managed to take advantage of that. Ronald Reagan, when he was president in the early 1980s, worked with Southern Democrats. He worked also, by the way, with blue-collar Democrats in states like Ohio and Michigan, and got a lot of legislation passed in favor of the Reagan Revolution by grouping these together, by finding common ground. Well, now compare that to 2009, 2010, 2012, where Republican ideology stands up here, and even Southern Democrats have joined Democrats and Northern Democrats almost in the same spot. This is too large a gap to make up in terms of ideology. That doesn't explain all of the problems in terms of passing laws, but it explains a lot. And it also explains that what we've lost is kind of those middle agents, the Bob Michaels, we're about to lose the Olympia Snows, we've lost Olympia Snow, those individuals who might be a little more in the middle and in a place to work some kind of compromise. It's impossible to compromise when the gap is this great. And that is something that's been obviously a problem, the loss of the political middle. This is not to say that compromise is by definition good. I think a lot of times compromise is not good because you end up getting nothing good from either side of the debate. But when both sides agree, something needs to be done. And a very small group are able to basically hold either party hostage. That is a problem. Second problem, and this is a very big problem, is gerrymandering. Now, we could talk about gerrymandering for weeks, and I think some of you have a general idea of what gerrymandering is, just to make sure we're all on the same page. This is not one person, one vote. Okay? The Supreme Court has said you cannot have a congressional district with one with 100,000 and then one with 1 million. Because the congressional district with 100,000 in it is giving more power to its individuals, one representative, than the one with 1 million that have the same one representative. So all congressional districts in this country have to be approximately near the same number. Now, it's hard when you only have one House member, but generally it has to be approximately the same number. I don't know, the latest might be around 800,000. Okay. That's not an issue because the Supreme Court will get involved with that. What they will not get involved with is when state legislatures, when redistricting takes place every 10 years, basically configure a district that puts tons of Republicans into one district so that the Republican has job safety, or puts tons of Democrats in one district so that the Democrat has relative job safety. What that does is it encourages a lot of things. Mostly the election of people who are not anywhere close to the middle. Take a look at this district. This is one of my favorite districts. This is a North Carolina district. Some of you are aware of it. It manages to jam almost every Democrat within hailing distance of Interstate 85 into this one district. And that's really what it starts from Charlotte and goes all the way up to Durham and Greensboro. It's basically following Interstate 85. The joke about this district is if you rode up Interstate 85 and opened up doors on both sides, you'd hit everybody in the district. This is a district that elects a congressperson, a Democrat from North Carolina. And it's safe to say that given how many Democrats are in this district, by some measures 70, 80, 90%, that person will never lose that district. Never. I mean, that Democrat is secure in that district. Now, that has implications, right? More than half of us in this country today live in what are called landslide districts. These are districts where the congressman will regularly win by more than 20, 25, even 30% of the vote. It was only a quarter of the districts that were like that 25, 30 years ago. Now it's half, thanks to redistricting like this in North Carolina. Well, if you're elected from a district like that, as so many are, what is your motivation to move to the middle? What is your motivation to compromise or moderate? The answer is you have none. There's nothing that's going to happen. You're safe. You can basically keep with the party and stick with the party line, and you're going to make the people very happy in the district who are very conservative, whereas the very small number of moderates in the district may very well not be able to stop you. And it creates a lack of a need to be responsive. Right? As political winds shift, moderate districts are affected. But this district, I mean, how much it would take a hurricane wind and you still could not knock a Democrat out of this district. And so response to political climates, response to changes are not going to really affect that person that much. If you want to put your job security first, you create a district like that, you make people safe. Or you create a Republican district, you create safe. And we have a lot of them like this. What you're not necessarily doing is listening to the general public. And so that's one of the things that this does. It creates a disconnect between popular opinion and where districts stand. Most people are aware of the statistic that in 2012, more than 50% of the people who voted for House members who were Democrats. And yet the Republicans held control because they were better at districts like that. And don't let the Democrats off the hook. They'd be more than happy to take control of the House without gaining popular approval either. That's the disconnect that we really have here. A third factor that really explains this do-nothing political system has to be talked about, and that is the endless campaign for president. Now, you've heard this before. This is not really that much news. Candidates have to announce they want to run for president 2 years before in most instances. Well, 2 years before is one thing. Guess what? If you want to announce 2 years before the presidential election, then you better start exploring whether you're going to announce 3 years before the election. And you know what that means. That means right now, people are going to start talking about running for president. This guy, Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, has got to start talking about running for president now, because in a little more than a year, he's got to announce. Now, if Rand Paul has to start talking about these things now, how is he in a position to compromise in a way that might make the Democrats look good nationally? If he hopes to be the standard bearer of the party, and he has to actually start making those hopes official now, he's not in a position to cut a deal because they're already running the 2016 presidential election right now. It's not just him, right? We're going to start hearing from the Democrats too. Like, for example, her. I'm sure she's going to be running. Do you know who she is? Anybody know who she is? Hillary Clinton. Oh, you're mad at me because I used a 1993, okay? 20 years ago. How about 1973, Hillary Clinton? Anybody remember that? Remember her? Yeah, okay. Okay, now, my conservative friends are saying that's not fair. You're cutting the age process on her, but our guy. I found a picture of Rand Paul from college, okay? So to try to make it fair, what do you think? It looks pretty good, right? He has more hair than I ever had. No, that's, okay, so that's fair, but it still feels a little off. We're still closer. So I'm going to give you Hillary Clinton now. I'm going to make everything fair. Does that make everybody feel? Yeah, I think she would have rather gone with 73. But okay, nonetheless, the bottom line is we're going to start hearing from these candidates now, and they're going to start telling us if they're going to run for president or not. How do you create a system that allows for cooperation within a year of the other election when you've already started the new one? There's no time to cooperate, right? I mean, if you actually cut a deal that allows the president to get legislation in, you are not cooperating, you are cavorting with the enemy. And so, I mean, 50 years ago, to some extent, there was a honeymoon period of at least a year or two when you could actually try to get legislation done and not be already positioning yourself for the next election. That is clearly gone, and that is a factor. Fourth thing, I'll just give you a fourth. There's a reason why we have this do-nothing political system. Well, let's actually say one more thing about the third. This guy, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, he is not running for president anytime soon. But I think he is indicative of this issue of cooperating, cavorting. Most of you are aware that in October of 2010, he gave a public speech, and he was asked. Now, this is right before the 2010 midterm elections, which he thought, and it turned out the Republicans gave President Obama what he called a shellacking. This is also 2 years before the 2012 presidential election, even longer before that. And he was asked, what's your agenda? What is your policy agenda for the next 2 years, especially if you take control of Congress? And he said very clearly what a lot of Republicans were probably thinking. The single most important thing in our agenda is we want to defeat President Obama for re-election. Now, this has always been the case, right? I mean, Democrats wanted to defeat George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, and that was important to them. Nobody should ever deny that it's the case. They certainly want to defeat the other side. But this was always something that kind of took place behind the scenes, privately. Publicly, you spoke of an agenda, a policy agenda, and maybe even some places where you could find common ground. I think what's so interesting about Senator McConnell's statement is he didn't get any blowback for this. Even when Obama won re-election, you heard very little about, see, Senator McConnell was part of the problem. Not at all. In fact, And I love this part. Currently, Senator McConnell, who's up for re-election in 2014, has been challenged in the Republican primaries by a gentleman by the name of Matt Bevin, a conservative businessman from the right who claims that Senator McConnell is a hopeless, moderate cooperator and part of the problem. He talks to Joe Biden too much. So this is cooperation. And there are no heroes on the Democratic side either on this regard. Now, the fourth factor that I want to quickly mention, and then we'll talk about maybe how to fix some of these things, the mighty filibuster. Let's just get the statistics out. The concept of a filibuster is that in the Senate, you can talk or debate a topic to death, and nobody can stop you unless they get 60 votes. And what that does is, in effect, create a 60-vote requirement to get legislation through the Senate. There were only 23 filibusters in the whole 100 years of the 19th century. 23 total. Who did filibusters back then? Historians tell us it was mostly buffoons, exhibitionists. I mean, filibusters were not something that were done by serious legislators. Well, look now. The dam broke in 1993. This was a Democratic Congress in 1993, a Democratic Senate beginning that year, certainly for President Clinton. 32 filibusters. 32 filibusters that year alone. And as we stand here today, we get nearly 40 filibusters per year, creating the equivalent of a 60-vote requirement, which makes it very hard, obviously, for any legislation to pass. Now, that's all kind of the causes of this do-nothing political system, but we're not going to let off the hook one of the really big features that makes all this probable and even possible, and that is, of course, the Constitution of the United States. We do want to celebrate the Constitution on its 226th birthday, but as I told somebody a little earlier, I like to say, we did. 3 years ago, we celebrated my grandmother's 90th birthday. It was a wonderful affair. We celebrated it. And then we went into the next room and talked a lot about all the crazy things she's said for the last 10 or 15 years, and some of them are pretty crazy. You can celebrate something with it, but still also find its flaws and find its issues and figure out what to do about it. And I think it is important to understand there are features of the Constitution that make life difficult in terms of fixing this problem, this constitutional paralysis. First of all, extremely limited our ability to challenge gerrymanders in court. Assuming you have the one person, one vote, the only type of gerrymander that has worked or managed to actually succeed, a challenge to a filibuster, is on the basis of racial discrimination. In other words, because no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, or equal protection of law, because of the 14th Amendment, you cannot simply create a district whose primary purpose is to jam all of a racial minority in one district and all of a racial majority in another. But there's nothing about the 14th Amendment that stops or allows courts to, for example, prevent them from putting all sorts of Democrats in a district or all sorts of Republicans in a district. And that creates a very big problem because you're not going to win a court fight trying to stop the Snake District of North Carolina unless you can show racial animus or intent. The Constitution is impossible to amend, right? We've amended it less than 30 times in 226 years. It is an incredibly hard document to amend. That allows members of Congress to say, hey, if I just wait this out, nothing's going to get in the way of leaving the status quo in place, because there's no way to change the fundamental document. The political parties clearly enjoy unlimited political power, and that's because the Constitution says nothing about them. The Founding Fathers didn't think about political parties, or if they did, they certainly didn't talk about it. George Washington thought political parties were a terrible thing and certainly did not want to give them any institutional support. But because they're not in the Constitution, they're not regulated or limited by the Constitution. And of course, each house, the Senate and the House, get to determine their own procedures. They get to determine whether they'll have a filibuster or the like. And this is certainly part of the problem of constitutional paralysis, that there's no way really to challenge House procedures. They get to set their own. And I want to throw a fifth in that we never talk about, but it is an important part of this discussion, and that is the presidential veto. The numbers are clear. When the president vetoes something, it sticks 95% of the time. 95%. Only 5% of the time does Congress override. Now, why that's important? Presidents don't veto a ton like they used to. And when they do, one would expect it would be somewhat of a controversial circumstance where Congress might consider overriding. But they're generally unable to. And that's because to get 2/3 of both the House and the Senate to override a presidential veto would require that the president's party stand against him publicly. And they're not willing to do that. Even Democrats who disagree with President Obama on his veto and on the legislation, even they will support him on the override because they don't want to embarrass the president. Maybe they're worried about elections. Maybe they're worried about a lot of things. But the bottom line is vetoes have created a tripartite system, a system where in order to get laws passed, you've got to get through not only the House and the Senate, but you have to get through the president too. And that's certainly something that the founding fathers never imagined. Okay, well, what about solutions? I guess we could change the Constitution, right? I mean, that would be great. And if we change the Constitution, what might we do? A friend of mine, a professor from the Indiana University, David Oretlicker, wrote a book called Two Presidents Are Better Than One, where he argued for a two-headed presidency featuring a Republican and a Democrat, and then they'd work together more often and deal with Congress more effectively, and this is never going to happen. Okay, most of you are much younger than me, but those of us who remember the old TV show Odd Couple, okay, I think we almost ran into that with Bush and Gore, right, when they couldn't figure out who the president was. Maybe they should do it together, and I wouldn't hold your breath on this happening. I've heard people talk about the need for a parliamentary system like in Britain. Isn't that ironic? After revolting against Britain, we're now going to take their system. And clearly this is never going to happen either, nor should it happen. But I do think it's interesting that those who argue for it talk about, you know what, if a third party gets 17% of the vote, shouldn't they get 70% of the House members? And in our current system, they get 0. So I mean, I think there are aspects of a parliamentary system worth considering, but this isn't going to happen anytime soon. And of course, when we are in trouble, what do? We look to the reasonable people of California. And when the reasonable people of California, I'm sure there's people from California watching this video now, God bless you, you have a way around legislative paralysis, the referendum. And isn't that really what we need in this country? More elections. More days when we have to go vote. But this time for referendums that are very often hundreds of pages long, thousands of words long, that nobody reads anyway. Who'll tell us what to do? Probably the political parties. So the kind of anti or changing Constitution methods, I wouldn't hold your breath on any of them. The good news is that the Constitution has some flexibility. It makes these problems happen, but it also provides within its structure a chance to change things. Maybe not so radically as the ones we just talked about, but certainly some. And I want us to at least consider some of the ways that we can change things. One thing we can do, obviously, is eliminate the filibuster by a simple majority vote. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires that or allows a filibuster of a filibuster. And so you have had the Senate occasionally, about once every 2 or 3 years, consider the possibility of eliminating the filibuster by a simple majority vote, which is the way many procedures are handled. Now, it's never worked. Why? Because the majority in the Senate fears that it will become the minority in the Senate. So Harry Reid, pushed to the brink, ends up not giving up the filibuster, not allowing that majority vote, because he might be the minority leader in 2014 or 2016, and what comes around goes around. But this is, again, this is a fear that doesn't kind of talk straight about the need to actually legislate in a democratic government. And so let's understand, it's up to the public to get angry about this, but the Constitution does not prevent this. And I love this nuclear option, which is always threatened. If you do this, we'll have a nuclear option and we won't be able to pass any legislation at all. I think a lot of people wonder whether any senator could survive simply voting or refusing to vote on anything. It's there, don't hold your breath, but it's certainly a possibility. This one, I think, is not just a possibility, this is a necessity. Transparency. Do you know how many secret votes take place in Congress? Secret votes take place all the time. Did you know that? Did you know? The reason you didn't know it is because they're secret votes. See, that's the definition. You don't get to know about this. In 1968, Richard Nixon, running for president, said, I have a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. And the press said, this is great, tell us what you're going to do. He goes, I can't tell you. Secret. So I mean, I think secrets are a wonderful thing, but they are not really good in terms of democratic government. And I think that UCAs are unanimous consent agreements. The ability for them to jam through stuff by simply saying unanimous consent agreement, voice votes. I think you at least have to start forcing senators and House members to vote on the record. And that I think is very frustrating. This isn't going to do massive change. But the notion that we're still sitting here with secret votes, it's very hard for me to really accept that. Gerrymanders. We talked about that a lot. We absolutely need better court oversight of gerrymanders. And I throw up the First Amendment and the 15th Amendment because constitutional scholars have at least played with the fact that if you are jammed into a Democratic district and you're a Democrat, and you have no ability to basically shift who gets to win your district, you have issues of your ability to express yourself politically. I think the 15th Amendment and the question of voter dilution is also interesting as well. Surely there's nothing on the face of it that prevents the Supreme Court from looking into real abuses, extreme abuses that in essence dilute the votes of either Republicans or Democrats. And just to show you how bad this thing gets, let's even go beyond North Carolina. This is a district in Illinois that goes around Chicago. It was an attempt to get as many Hispanic and Latin Americans as possible in that district, along with other racial minorities, and basically create a Democratic district surrounding the Chicago area. Does this look like anything to you guys? Put on your, let's pretend it's a Rorschach test, okay? Squint a little bit. Does this look like a congressional district? What does this look like? Anybody? They call this, the headphone district, okay? Here, I'll help you. I'll put the headphone up. There you go. It's a headphone district. Now, I'm not sure what a district should look like, but headphone districts seem a little extreme. You want to try another one? Okay. How about the 17th district in Illinois? Well, I'll go back with that one. This is the 17th district, Illinois, the red. Okay, the orange. The 17th district, Illinois. You want me to make it a little bigger? Will that help? Okay. Here's the 17th district of Illinois. The heck is this? Anybody have an idea? What does it look like? Can you see a shape? Well, what do you see? Pac-Man, somebody said. What else? The Pac-Man district? Anybody? I had one student once told me Tyrannosaurus Rex district, the Scorpion district, okay? Do you know what the official, well, the unofficial, but the unofficial official name is for this district? Anybody know? Look hard. They call this the rabbit on the skateboard district. This is a rabbit riding a skateboard, okay? Again, it's one heck of a district. I don't really know what this has to do with democratic government, but it surely must make the rabbits happy. Okay? So I throw this all out at you because, again, the court willingness to look the other way at a district that jams so many Democrats in, it contributes to having extreme liberals or extreme conservatives and nothing in the middle. The fourth possibility, just moderates don't vote as much as, I'm not talking about independents, I'm talking about moderates. I'm talking about people who are really, kind of in the middle and swing both ways. Many of them don't vote. Many of them, by the way, don't buy books. Have you ever been to a Barnes & Noble and you go to the political books table and you see a lot of books by Ann Coulter saying all Democrats must die, and you see a lot of books by Michael Moore and Al Franken saying all the Republicans must die and Limbaugh has a weight problem, right? You got those books. You don't see a lot of moderate books, right? How many books are I'm in the middle and don't know what I think? Or, you just don't find many books like that. Moderates don't buy books. Moderates also don't vote. What we need to do, or what somebody needs to do, if you want to actually find a way to stop the polarization, you got to get moderates to the polls. And you know what? They're not going to go on their own. You're going to have to drive them. I'm actually saying, now I know one or two won't make a difference. You got to shove a lot of moderates into your car. And I don't know where you went to college. I went to college at the University of Virginia. Every once in a while, we would try to jam as many people as we could in a car. It would look something like this. I do warn you, though, if you're going to try to jam like 40 moderates in a car, and by the way, I have no idea why the moderates here are wearing light blue. It's not like the moderate color, right? I mean, the University of North Carolina maybe. But if you're going to do that, no smart cars, okay? These are really small, okay? Go with the station wagons. Go with the Tahoes. Do something that can fit some more moderates. And I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding, okay? There really is a problem here in terms of getting people to the polls who sit in the middle and are frustrated by both sides. Because if they don't go to the polls, you're left with extremes on both sides, voting for extremes on both sides, and that remains part of the problem. Now, I'm saying some things that may be a little heretical, But in closing, the question again is, what are we going to think about this Constitution of ours on Constitution Day? Is Constitution something that we have to leave alone and get scared of? Or might there be room for some tinkering, some playing in the joints? And so I say that simply because this is a picture that people react differently to, right? I mean, some people see this picture and they get really, really scared. Some people see this picture and say, maybe this is what we need. A little less celebration and glorious reverence for the Constitution, and a little more willingness to rip it up when it doesn't really help us. But I think that ultimately you're going to have to decide, just like the public decides to some extent to put up with some of this do-nothing political system. I will leave it there and open up. We have about 15-20 minutes if anybody has any questions or comments about this, the Constitution, or anything else. Thank you for your time. Are there any questions at all? Speak loud if you have a question, because people elsewhere want to hear it. Yes, sir.
One of the, I'm a historian, and in the past, in filibusters, they made people actually get up and talk. And you had to talk, and they would bring in the cots. Lyndon Johnson was famous when they tried to filibuster the civil rights legislation. They brought in the cots, and they got a bunch of old men back then sleeping on cots. They got kind of tired, and they'd vote to end the filibuster. We aren't really having a filibuster, we're only having a threat of a filibuster.
Right.
I guess my thought is, you could end a lot of it, is that, okay, fine, talk. We'll go home.
There has been, this is really something that's only happened in the last 20 or 30 years. The decision to say, if you're going to filibuster, and you're really willing to filibuster, we're not going to make you stand there and talk. And so that the willingness to say, we accept that you're willing to filibuster, we're willing to back it from your party, and so thus at that point, assuming there are not 60 votes to break it, that's really the end. I think to some extent what that missed, and so I agree with you, is that when a person has to stand there and talk all night, the famous Jimmy Stewart movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where he talked and read the yellow pages and read. What that does to some extent is create attention. Didn't that happen just in Texas recently when Wendy Davis filibustered an abortion bill in the state legislature? I mean, I think to some extent she got a level of attention because she was actually out there kind of putting herself out there in a potentially vulnerable state. And I think we saw, for example, in the early 1960s, Southern segregationists were willing to stand on the sword and actually, the famous Strom Thurmond filibuster, he was actually talking for a very long period of time. And I think it creates a level of public perception and thus participation that the quiet filibusters don't. So I guess to some extent group that in with the secret votes and the willingness to say the reason why you're able to do this procedurally is that not a lot of people are able to examine what we're doing. For example, just to react to your point, we don't even know who the filibustering agent is, right? So some person says, I'm planning to filibuster this to the minority leader, and he says, gotcha, and the filibuster is announced, but nobody even knows who to hold accountable for getting it started. And I can't imagine that that's great for democratic governance. The warning is, obviously, that because of the polarization, that Republicans will support Republican filibusters and Democrats will support Democrats, and thus, unlike in the past, they'll probably be willing to spell that person, right? Do baton hands-offs of that person. You are allowed to yield to a person for a question, and then the question can take 3 days. So I think there are, but what it would do again is it would announce this person is the reason why nothing is happening. And if the public is fine with nothing happening, then they won't complain to that person. But if they're not fine, and the polls tell you that they're not fine any more than they like Paris Hilton, then it seems to me what you're saying is absolutely correct. I mean, it's hard to imagine how it's justified, other than the majority doesn't want to make a problem, because then they'll be the one who have to talk all night when the majority becomes the minority. Excellent question, an excellent point. Other thoughts, questions? Peter.
One of the points you made was that people are the constant campaigning for presidency. Is it just raising money? Because now with social media and with the internet and all the media coverage that happens, immediacy seems to be the tune of the day. Why does it take 3 years to get elected?
Yeah, I'm reluctant to say that the reason it's 3 years is about the money, right? Because if you think about the individuals who started early and built up success through social media, they didn't do it because of the money. Right? Howard Dean would be the famous example in 2004. He started earlier than anyone else, built up his army of Deaniacs, made the social, invented social media campaigns that Obama perfected 4 years later, but he didn't build up much money. In fact, after Iowa, he almost had no money left, no more money to scream, if you remember the famous Iowa scream of Howard Dean's. So I'm always reluctant to blame everything on money. I also think we have to understand that even if you go 100 years ago when there were no big money campaigns, what there were, right, were behind the scenes, smoke-filled rooms where a handful of people with a lot of power determine things. And that's really the same problem as having a campaign finance system that does that. So, the truth is that in general, we already know who the 3 or 4 candidates are who could possibly be president. For all that we say Barack Obama came out of nowhere, if you looked 2 or 3 years before the 2008 presidential election, he would have been on a list of 3 or 4 people, including Hillary Clinton and John Edwards, who were thought to have a chance to win the Democratic nomination. He didn't come quite as out of... I think the last time we truly had a candidate who came out of nowhere was probably Jimmy Carter in 1976. And he ran a pretty long campaign too. So I don't know if it's simply about the money. But I do think social media is a big deal in this sense. Let's say Rand Paul is thinking of running for president in 2016, but he doesn't want to run quite yet. If he gives a talk, and if he gives a speech, and if there's anything in that speech that might be viewed as contributing to cooperation, giving Barack Obama an olive branch, throwing a bone at him on a particular issue where they agree. You can already see how, because social media would cover it, right? Because the different cable stations would say this is great or this is terrible. Because it could get played over and over on YouTube. You are in a situation where things you say 3 years earlier still matter 2 years later. Whereas in the past, something you said 3 years later literally would disappear. Along with any evidence that you ever said it. Some of us are old enough to remember that Supreme Court nominees would spend a lot of time said something that people said he said. Very hard to imagine that happening in the era of the 47% comment of Romney. So from that standpoint, I agree that the social media makes the thing last longer, but I'm not sure it's about raising money. I think it's about the visibility in what you say. But time will tell. Time will tell. Other thoughts? Questions? Yes. Sure.
Really pertains to a lot, but
It may not. It's Constitution Day. We're all open-minded.
social media, a lot of the people today are looking at more behaviors.
Well,
Behaviors in their personal lives and things like that instead of...
it's a fair point. I mean, we use, to some extent, social media to look at personal lives. But one warning. I mean, maybe some people remember in 1988, most people thought that Gary Hart had a very good chance of becoming the Democratic nominee. He had finished a close second to Walter Mondale in 1984. He was caught in early 1987 on a boat with a pinup, a former pinup, not his wife, and the boat was, of course, called the SS Monkey Business, which you can't make that up. And by the way, he had dared the media, cover me, you won't find anything, and it didn't take very long. So I think personal peccadillos, to some extent, that predates it. But you are right to the extent that your ability to escape any kind of notice, your ability to declare, after that year, I'm done, is much harder than it ever was before. I don't know if people remember in 2000 when George W. Bush was running for president, and it came out just a week and a half before the election that he had lied or not told the truth about when he had a drunk driving arrest. He had said it was this year, it turned out to be after that year. And what his basic argument was is, whatever I said, we're talking about 25, 30 years ago, right? We're talking about the late 1960s. I mean, you can't go back that far. And I think that he won the election ultimately, but I think the media's coverage of that made very clear we will go back that far. And of course, guess what happened 4 years later? John Kerry had to defend actions in and around Vietnam War that were also 25 or 30 years ago. So I kind of agree with you, but to some extent, a political decision has been made. You don't get a free ride or a fresh start. The public will decide if they'll elect you anyway. But there are no more fresh starts. You've got to at least live with the baggage that's on YouTube and everywhere else. And I think that maybe that's fortunate because it gives the public the decision to the power to decide whether something matters. But I think it's unfortunate to the extent that everybody in the country seems to get a second chance, right? I mean, at some point, A-Rod and Paula Deen will get their second chance. Everybody gets a fresh start in America except for Pete Rose. So from that standpoint, I think it is a little unfortunate that in politics we may be taking potentially excellent candidates out of the mix for things that happened so long ago, personal peccadillos, as you would say. Thank you for that question. Anything else? Late on a Tuesday afternoon, Constitution Day. Thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it.